The Ottoman Empire does not enter the story through smoke, cannon fire, or collapsing walls. It enters through quiet rooms where the air is still and the light is low. Oil lamps flicker against stone walls. Ink pools at the tip of a pen, then settles into paper. Outside, the empire looks whole. Ships crowd the harbors. Markets pulse with noise. Minarets rise over cities that have endured for centuries. Soldiers still march. Flags still fly. From a distance, nothing appears broken. History teaches collapse as spectacle. Armies clash. Capitals fall. Empires burn. But this story begins somewhere far less dramatic, because power does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it signs. For generations, the Ottoman Empire controlled the arteries of global trade. It stood between continents, between seas, between worlds. Wealth passed through its ports. Taxes flowed from its lands. Its rulers negotiated as equals with Europe's strongest states. This was not a weak empire, waiting to be conquered. It was a system that had endured pressure, war, and rebellion before. That is what makes this story unsettling. Because Britain did not defeat the Ottomans on the battlefield. It did not seize the empire by force. It learned something far more effective. Control does not always require occupation. Sometimes it only requires leverage. In the 19th century, a different kind of weapon began to shape the world. It did not explode. It did not kill instantly. It worked slowly, invisibly, and with remarkable precision. That weapon was debt. Britain mastered it. Loans replaced cannons. Interest replaced invasion. Balance sheets replaced battle plans. This was not an accident. It was strategy. While armies were expensive and unpredictable, finance offered something better. It offered control without responsibility, influence without administration, power without flags. Think about that. What if you could dominate an empire without ever claiming it? From the outside, Britain framed its actions as help, assistance, partnership. The language was modern and reasonable. The Ottomans were told they needed reform. They needed railways to connect their lands. They needed new weapons to defend their borders. They needed a modern bureaucracy to compete with Europe. All of this was true. All of it cost money. Britain had money. More importantly, Britain had credit. And credit, once extended, creates relationships that are never equal. Each loan came with promises, stability, growth, time. The empire could pay its soldiers. It could fund its administration. It could project strength a little longer. For Ottoman leaders facing pressure from every direction, these loans looked like lifelines. Refusing them meant immediate crisis. Accepting them meant survival. At least, that is how it appeared. But credit is never neutral. It always shifts power. The moment money changes hands, influence follows. Quietly, legally, permanently. This is where the invisible conquest begins. Not with deception, but with structure. Britain did not force the Ottomans to borrow. It simply positioned itself as the only solution. European markets closed ranks. British finance stood ready. The terms were written carefully. Interest rates, repayment schedules, guarantees. On paper, everything seemed orderly, professional, fair. In reality, each clause narrowed Ottoman freedom. Each agreement pledged future revenue to past borrowing, customs duties, tax streams, state income that had not yet been collected. The empire was not losing territory. It was losing options. Imagine the pressure inside those rooms. Officials studying numbers they did not fully control. Translators moving between languages. Advisors watching silently. Decisions had to be made quickly. Soldiers needed pay. Infrastructure demanded funding. Delay meant unrest. Default meant humiliation. Britain understood this pressure. It did not need to rush. Time favored the creditor. Time always favors the creditor. History often explains imperial collapse through decay or incompetence. This explanation feels comfortable. It suggests failure was inevitable. This story argues something more precise. The Ottoman Empire was not simply collapsing. It was being reorganized. Its sovereignty was being converted into obligations. Its authority was being transformed into debt service. This is not about morality. It is about mechanics. About how systems of finance can achieve what armies cannot. Think about that. An empire that once dictated terms now asking for extensions. As the loans accumulated, the logic tightened. Borrowing to grow slowly became borrowing to sustain. The difference matters. Growth creates surplus. Survival consumes it. The Ottomans crossed that line without ceremony. No single moment marked the change. No announcement declared dependency. It happened gradually, invisibly, like water rising behind a dam. Each year, more revenue was committed. Each year, less remained discretionary. The empire still governed, but its freedom to choose was shrinking. Britain did not need to issue commands. It only needed assurances. Guarantees that repayments would be honored. When confidence wavered, pressure followed. Not military pressure, financial pressure. Markets reacted. Credit tightened. Rates increased. The cost of survival rose. This was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. But arithmetic can be ruthless, especially when one side controls the terms. Consider the asymmetry. Britain could absorb defaults. It had global reach, diverse revenue, a deep financial system. The Ottomans could not. A missed payment threatened confidence. Confidence threatened stability. Stability threatened rule. The empire's leaders understood this. They understood that sovereignty now depended on credibility in foreign markets. That credibility was fragile, and Britain knew it. This is why the conquest was invisible. There were no dramatic confrontations, no declarations of domination, just a steady narrowing of choices. British influence grew not because of force, but because of dependence. The Ottomans still governed their lands, but increasingly, they did so within constraints shaped elsewhere. Decisions had to account for lenders. Policies had to reassure creditors. Reform was no longer only about governance. It was about repayment. Think about the psychology of that shift. Power begins to feel conditional. Authority becomes provisional. Leaders stop asking what is best and start asking what is acceptable. This is how control embeds itself, not through occupation, but through habit, through routine, through financial obligation that becomes normalized. The empire did not wake up conquered. It slowly adjusted to limitation. Outside observers saw continuity. Diplomats attended ceremonies. Trade continued. The empire appeared stable. This appearance mattered. Britain needed the Ottomans functional, not collapsed. A functioning debtor is far more useful than a failed one. Stability protected investments. It preserved influence. It allowed leverage to deepen without resistance. Collapse was never the immediate goal. Control was. This chapter is not about villains or victims. It is about power in its modern form, about how influence adapts to opportunity. Britain did not invent debt. It perfected its use as strategy. It understood that finance could reach where armies could not. It could enter palaces. It could shape policy. It could outlast regimes. Once embedded, it was almost impossible to remove without catastrophic cost. So the central question emerges clearly. How do you dominate an empire without ever planting a flag? You offer help when it is desperate. You provide solutions that create dependence. You write contracts that turn future income into present obligation. You wait, and you let arithmetic do the work. By the time the consequences are visible, the options are gone. This is a foundation of the Ottoman debt trap. Not a single act, but a process. Not conquest by invasion, but conquest by agreement. In the chapters that follow, the illusion of strength will give way to structure. The mechanics will become clearer, and the invisible will become undeniable. Because once debt becomes policy, power no longer needs soldiers. It only needs patience. To understand how the trap worked, you first have to understand why it was so easy to step into it. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire did not look like a collapsing state. It looked busy, alive. Its cities were dense with people and trade. Markets echoed with bargaining voices. Caravans moved inland. Ships crowded the docks, unloading goods from across the Mediterranean and beyond. The empire still sat at the crossroads of global commerce. Europe depended on these routes. Asia flowed through them. Africa connected through them. On the map, the Ottoman position was still commanding. Geography alone suggested strength. This appearance mattered more than pride. It shaped how the Ottomans were treated and how they treated themselves. They were not negotiating from the posture of a defeated power. They were negotiating as an empire trying to keep pace with a changing world. And the world was changing fast. Industrialization was reshaping economies. Railways were shrinking distances. Modern armies demanded constant funding. Administration was becoming more complex, more expensive, more technical. Power now required infrastructure, not just territory. The Ottomans understood this. They did not reject modernization. They pursued it urgently. Modernization, however, has a cost. Railways do not build themselves. Ports require expansion. Weapons require factories. Bureaucracies require salaries. None of this could be achieved with tradition alone. The empire needed capital, large amounts of it. Britain and other European powers had already gone through this transformation. They had banks, markets, and credit systems designed to mobilize money at scale. The Ottomans did not. Their revenues were steady, but limited. Their systems were not built for rapid industrial investment. Borrowing appeared logical, even responsible. From Britain's perspective, the Ottoman Empire was not a target to be destroyed. It was an asset to be stabilized. A functioning Ottoman state protected trade routes. It balanced rival powers. It maintained order in regions Britain preferred not to administer directly. Lending money fit this goal perfectly. Loans could strengthen the empire while tying it closer to British interests. This dual purpose was never hidden. It was simply framed as mutual benefit. The language of partnership filled diplomatic correspondence. Britain spoke of reform, efficiency, progress. Advisors were sent, not commanders. Engineers arrived, not generals. Rail lines were proposed, not annexations. On the surface, this was cooperation between modern states. The Ottomans were encouraged to see borrowing as a step toward equality with Europe. Access to credit was presented as a sign of legitimacy, not weakness. And for a time, it worked exactly as promised. Money flowed into state projects. Soldiers were paid on time. Infrastructure advanced. The empire bought itself breathing room. Delayed unrest. Deferred crisis. The streets of major cities remained crowded. Government continued to function. There was no immediate disaster to signal danger. This is why the illusion was so powerful. Nothing visibly collapsed. In fact, things appear to improve. That is how debt often seduces. It solves today while quietly mortgaging tomorrow. But beneath the surface, the structure of borrowing mattered more than the amount. Loans were not free injections of capital. They were obligations tied to future income. Interest accrued, regardless of conditions. Repayment schedules did not pause for drought, unrest, or war. The Ottomans began pledging revenues that had not yet been collected. Customs duties, tax streams, predictable income that creditors valued highly. These guarantees made borrowing possible. They also narrowed future flexibility. Think about that trade. The empire received cash now by promising income later. That income could no longer be used freely. It was already spoken for. As borrowing increased, the portion of revenue under obligation grew. This did not feel dangerous at first. The numbers were manageable. The empire was large. Its economy was diverse. But debt compounds quietly. What begins as manageable becomes structural. Britain understood compounding better than most. Its financial system was built on it. Time multiplied money. The longer obligations remained, the stronger creditor position became. The Ottomans, meanwhile, were using loans not only to invest, but to maintain stability. This distinction is crucial. Borrowing for growth can create new revenue. Borrowing for maintenance does not. It only postpones pressure. Over time, the empire crossed that line. Still, the illusion held. Ceremonies continued. Diplomacy remained formal. The Ottomans were not treated as a failed state. They were treated as a client. That distinction mattered. A client is respected enough to negotiate, but constrained enough to influence. Britain did not dictate policy openly. It did not need to. Financial dependency shapes decisions without commands. Leaders begin to anticipate creditor reactions. They adjust behavior preemptively. This is how influence embeds itself. Markets played their role. Creditworthiness became a measure of legitimacy. If the Ottomans missed payments or appeared unstable, borrowing costs rose. Higher costs meant more revenue committed to interest. More revenue committed meant less available for governance. This feedback loop was subtle but relentless. The empire was learning to govern with one eye always on foreign confidence. That changes priorities. It changes incentives. It changes what survival means. Inside the empire, this process was difficult to explain to the public. There was no invasion to rally against. No clear enemy. Decisions were made in offices, not on battlefields. The effects were delayed. People felt pressure without seeing cause. Taxes increased. Spending tightened. Services fluctuated. The state still existed, but its margins were thinner. Officials worked harder to achieve less. The system strained quietly. Britain benefited from this stability under constraint. A solvent but dependent Ottoman Empire was ideal. It secured trade routes, protected investments, required minimal oversight. Financial influence could be exercised through negotiations rather than force. When concerns arose, they were addressed through terms, not troops. This was efficient. It was modern. It was far less visible than traditional empire. The illusion of strength persisted because collapse was not immediate. Empires rarely fall in a straight line. They bend. They adjust. They compensate. The Ottomans did all of this. They reorganized finances. They sought new loans. They renegotiated terms. Each adjustment bought time. Each adjustment deepened dependency. There was no single disastrous decision. There was a series of reasonable ones. This is what makes the debt trap difficult to recognize. At every stage, the choice made sense in isolation. Pay soldiers now to prevent unrest. Invest in infrastructure to compete. Borrow to cover shortfalls. Refinance to manage obligations. None of these are irrational. Together, they create a system where the future is perpetually traded for the present. Eventually, the present runs out. By the late 19th century, the empire's finances were no longer just a domestic concern. They were a matter of international management. Foreign confidence dictated terms. Stability was judged externally. The Ottomans still governed, but within boundaries shaped by debt. Their sovereignty had not disappeared. It had been conditioned. From the outside, this still looked like partnership. Britain did not claim ownership. It did not rewrite borders. It spoke the language of assistance and order. That language mattered. It allowed influence to grow without provoking resistance. The Ottomans were not being conquered. They were being supported. That framing delayed reckoning. Yet the numbers told a different story. Revenue committed to debt service rose steadily. Flexibility declined. The empire's ability to respond independently to crisis weakened. When shocks arrived, there was little buffer. Debt had consumed it. What looked like strength was increasingly performance. The empire was standing, but it was standing on borrowed time. This chapter reveals why the conquest remained invisible for so long. The Ottomans were not weak in appearance. They were active participants in a system they believed they could manage. Britain did not break them suddenly. It allowed them to continue, constrained but functional. That is what made the mechanism so effective. Control did not arrive through humiliation. It arrived through normalization. The illusion of strength was real because the empire still functioned. But function is not freedom. And as the next chapter will show, once financial mechanisms hardened into authority, the line between assistance and control disappeared entirely. The moment the math stopped working, the illusion collapsed. The cracks did not announce themselves with a single shock. They spread slowly, quietly, like damp creeping through stone. At first, the empire adjusted without panic. Revenues tightened here. Spending shifted there. New loans refinanced old ones. On paper, the system still worked. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. Debt was no longer a temporary tool. It had become the operating environment. And once that happened, power followed the debt. As borrowing increased, Britain's concern shifted from encouragement to assurance. Creditors do not need land. They need certainty. They need guarantees that payments will arrive on time, every time. To secure that certainty, control began to move closer to the source of revenue itself. Customs duties became central. These were predictable, visible, and difficult to hide. They were the arteries of state income. When confidence wavered, attention turned there, not as a threat, but as a condition. Oversight entered quietly. It did not arrive as occupation. It arrived as supervision. Revenues were tracked more closely. Collection methods were scrutinized. Certain income streams were earmarked directly for repayment before they could be used elsewhere. This was not framed as punishment. It was framed as protection. Protection for lenders. Protection for stability. Protection for the empire's own credibility. The language was calm. The effect was decisive. Think about that shift. When revenue is pledged before it is collected, sovereignty becomes conditional. Decisions must account for obligations that cannot be delayed. Priorities are reordered. Paying creditors becomes as important as governing people, often more important. This is the moment when finance stops supporting the state and starts directing it. As repayments strained budgets, borrowing changed character. Early loans were about modernization and reform. Later loans were about survival. The distinction matters. Borrowing to build creates future capacity. Borrowing to endure consumes it. The Ottomans found themselves trapped in the second mode. Each loan was used to cover gaps created by the last. Interest stacked on interest. The margin for error vanished. When repayments faltered, influence hardened. This is where the invisible conquest became tangible. Financial bodies were established to manage and secure repayments. These institutions did not carry flags. They carried authority. Decisions once made by imperial councils were now subject to external approval, not officially, not publicly, but practically. Policy was shaped by what would reassure creditors. Anything else risked higher costs or closed markets. Imagine the change in decision-making. A government facing unrest considers relief, but relief costs money. Money committed elsewhere. A leader weighs reform against stability. Stability depends on confidence. Confidence depends on compliance. The calculus shifts. Governance becomes reactive. Innovation becomes risky. Every choice is filtered through its impact on debt. Britain did not need to issue orders. The system issued them automatically. Markets reacted faster than diplomats. If confidence dipped, borrowing costs rose. If costs rose, pressure increased. Pressure forced concessions. This feedback loop was relentless. It punished independence and rewarded predictability. Over time, the Ottomans learned what behavior kept the system functioning. They adapted accordingly. This is where conquest occurred. Without conquest, Britain did not administer provinces. It did not appoint governors. It did not police streets. It influenced outcomes by shaping incentives. Control was embedded in structure, not presence. That made it durable. It also made it difficult to challenge. There was no single authority to confront, just a web of obligations that could not be severed without collapse. Debt became policy. That phrase captures the transformation. Fiscal decisions were no longer tools of strategy. They were constraints imposed by history. The empire was governing inside a framework it did not design and could not escape. Attempts to renegotiate brought temporary relief at long-term cost. Each renegotiation confirmed dependence. Each compromise reduced autonomy. Inside the empire, the effects accumulated. Public services fluctuated. Investment slowed. Taxes rose in uneven ways. People felt strain without understanding its source. Officials blamed inefficiency. Critics blamed corruption. These explanations were not entirely wrong, but they missed a deeper cause. The system itself was draining flexibility. Even competent management could not overcome structural obligation. Britain's position strengthened with every cycle. As the primary creditor, it became indispensable, not because of malice, but because of arithmetic. The more exposed the empire became, the more necessary external confidence was. Britain provided that confidence, on its terms. This did not require constant intervention. The threat of withdrawal was enough. Consider how different this is from traditional empire. There were no uprisings to suppress, no garrisons to maintain. Influence was exercised through negotiation rooms, not fortresses. The cost of Britain was minimal. The returns were steady. This was empire without administration, control without responsibility. The Ottomans still ruled. Laws were still issued. Courts still functioned. But the range of viable choices narrowed. Large projects required approval. Emergency spending required reassurance. Even diplomacy was shaped by creditor perception. The empire's external posture softened. Risk became dangerous. Neutrality became safer. These shifts were subtle but cumulative. By this stage, borrowing was no longer a matter of choice. It was necessity. Revenues committed to repayment reduced internal investment. Reduced investment limited growth. Limited growth reduced revenue. The cycle reinforced itself. Breaking it would have required drastic measures. Default, radical restructuring. Both carried immediate consequences the empire could not absorb. The cost of exit was too high. This is how traps work. They are entered gradually and escaped violently. The Ottomans avoided violence by accepting constraint. That choice preserved short-term stability. It sacrificed long-term freedom. Britain benefited from that preference. Stability protected repayment. Constraint protected influence. The turning point was not a date. It was a realization. An unspoken understanding that the empire was no longer steering. It was responding. That realization changed everything. Confidence gave way to caution. Reform gave way to management. Vision gave way to accounting. The empire had not fallen, but it had been bound. Foreign oversight expanded as necessity demanded. Entire sectors of the economy were effectively collateral. Revenue streams were monitored. Spending patterns were evaluated. This was justified as efficiency. It also ensured priority of repayment. Over time, financial supervision became normalized. It was no longer extraordinary. It was expected. Think about the psychology of that normalization. When external oversight becomes routine, resistance fades. What once would have been unthinkable becomes administrative. Sovereignty erodes not through defeat, but through habituation. The empire adjusted its identity to fit its constraints. Britain's role remained understated. It did not celebrate control. It did not advertise dominance. Silence served its interests better. The less visible the influence, the less resistance it provoked. This was not occupation. It was architecture, and architecture lasts. As debt dictated policy, alternatives disappeared. Domestic reform without external approval risked instability. Military investment without assurance risked panic. Even internal dissent was constrained by fiscal reality. Suppressing unrest cost money. Money was scarce. Every action had a price, and that price was measured against obligations already owed. The system was not designed to collapse the empire. It was designed to secure repayment and influence. Collapse was inefficient. A weakened but functioning state was preferable. That is what the Ottomans became. Functional, dependent, constrained. The invisible conquest was complete, even if no one announced it. This chapter marks the moment where illusion gives way to mechanism, where partnership becomes control, where debt stops being a tool and becomes a master. The Ottomans were not defeated. They were absorbed into a system that prioritized external stability over internal sovereignty. That system would hold until shocks arrived that even finance could not contain. By the time those shocks came, the options were already gone. The empire had been living inside its obligations for too long. The balance sheets had done their work. Power had shifted. Quietly. Completely. Collapse does not always arrive with fire, noise, and sudden endings. Sometimes it arrives as fatigue, as systems stretch too thin to respond when pressure finally spikes. By the time the Ottoman Empire entered its final phase, much of the damage had already been done. The state still existed. Institutions still functioned. Laws were still enforced. But independence had been hollowed out from within. Financial control had reshaped decision-making so thoroughly that when crisis came, the empire had no room left to maneuver. Years of obligation had drained flexibility. Revenues were already committed. Budgets were already strained. Any shock, internal or external, now carried disproportionate risk. War unrest, trade disruption, even administrative reform required resources the state no longer controlled freely. Debt had not caused immediate collapse. It had ensured fragility. The empire could survive only as long as conditions remained stable. History rarely offers that luxury. When global pressures intensified, the limits became visible. Military conflict exposed weakness quickly. Funding armies required cash that could not be diverted without consequences. Inflation followed strain. Supply chains fractured. Confidence wavered. And when confidence wavers in a debt-dependent system, everything accelerates. Credit tightens. Costs rise. Choices narrow further. The empire entered a spiral it could not escape. This is the danger of financial dependency. It does not fail gradually. It holds until it breaks. The Ottoman state found itself responding to crises without reserves. Every decision carried external implications. Every emergency required negotiation. Sovereignty was no longer absolute. It was conditional. And conditions changed rapidly under stress. As war reshaped the region, the empire's weakened structure could not absorb the shock. Defeat was not simply military. It was systemic. Years of constrained policy meant fewer options, slower responses, and deeper consequences. The state had been optimized for repayment, not resilience. That optimization now worked against it. The aftermath was decisive. Borders shifted. Authority fragmented. New political entities emerged from the ruins of imperial administration. But they did not inherit a clean slate. They inherited disrupted economies, altered trade patterns, and financial obligations shaped by a previous era. Debt outlived the empire that incurred it. Influence persisted even after collapse. Britain emerged from this process in a strengthened position, not because it had conquered territory directly, but because it had shaped outcomes. Financial architecture had achieved what armies alone could not. It reorganized power across regions without requiring permanent occupation. This was modern empire in its most efficient form. Influence without administration. Control without responsibility. The invisible conquest had succeeded because it aligned with incentives. Britain did not need to manage daily governance. It needed stability, predictability, repayment. These goals encouraged policies that served creditor interests naturally. The system disciplined itself. Resistance became costly. Compliance became rational. The Ottomans did not fall because they were irrational. They fell because they made reasonable decisions inside an unreasonable structure. Each choice prioritized immediate survival. Each choice reduced long-term freedom. Over time, the gap between survival and sovereignty closed completely. When survival itself was threatened, there was nothing left to trade. This story is often remembered as decline, as mismanagement, as inevitable decay. That framing is incomplete. Decline suggests passivity. What happened here was interaction, engagement with a global system that rewarded capital and punished constraint. The Ottoman Empire was integrated into that system on unequal terms. Once integrated, exit was prohibitively expensive. Think about that. Power did not disappear. It relocated. Authority did not vanish. It transformed. Control moved from palaces to ledgers, from councils to contracts, from borders to balance sheets. This is not ancient history. It is a pattern. Look around the modern world. Nations still borrow to modernize. Infrastructure still arrives with conditions. Assistance still reshapes policy. Debt still disciplines behavior. The language has changed. The mechanisms remain. Financial leverage continues to influence sovereignty without formal conquest. The Ottoman experience offers a warning without drama. It shows how dependence builds quietly, how influence embeds itself legally, how choice erodes without visible coercion. No invasion required. No occupation declared. Just numbers accumulating over time. Empires once fell to armies. In the modern world, they often fall to obligations. The battlefield has shifted. The weapons are abstract. The consequences are just as real. Debt does not announce conquest. It normalizes it. History remembers the fall of empires through dates and treaties. It rarely remembers the invoices that made those endings unavoidable. But those invoices mattered. They shaped decisions long before collapse became visible. They determined who could act freely and who could not. The Ottoman Empire's invisible conquest was not unique. It was early. It demonstrated how financial systems could achieve geopolitical outcomes efficiently. That lesson was not forgotten. It was refined, repeated, exported. This is why the story matters now. Not as nostalgia, not as blame, but as insight. Understanding how power moves helps explain why sovereignty remains fragile in a connected world. Control does not always arrive with force. Often, it arrives as help. And that is the final truth of this story. Empires do not always lose their freedom when they are defeated. Sometimes they lose it when they are rescued. If this documentary helped you see history differently, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden mechanics of power, and share this story with others who want to understand how influence really works.